Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Open News meeting on what is the 21st day of the invasion of Ukraine. I'm Matt D'Ancona, I'm an editor at Tortoise, and as always in our Open News meetings, we'll be trying to zero in on what aspects of the news agenda we should be investigating at Tortoise in the various strands of our journalism. And as ever, we want you all to join in and to let us know what you're thinking and where you think we should be concentrating our efforts. So please do chip into the chat, which is being overseen by my colleague Phoebe Davis. I think this evening we'll start off, if possible, with the conflict, which remains clearly the dominant story in the world. And I'd like to, because it's so important, I think, to give some focus to what is an issue and a crisis of huge sprawl and scope, to look at the role of NATO, what it has done, what it hasn't done, perhaps what it should do, to look perhaps at President Zelensky's statement yesterday that Ukraine was not expecting membership anytime soon. He didn't rule out membership, but he made it clear that it wasn't, as far as he was concerned, on the bill of fare for the time being. And on that we have two terrific speakers whom we welcome. Professor Jamie Shea, who's held many posts at NATO, the last being Deputy Assistant General for Emerging Security Challenges, and he now holds a host of positions, far too many for me to mention, in the world of scholarship and policy making, notably as president at the Centre for War Studies at the University of Southern Denmark and a senior advisor at the European Policy Centre. And a very warm welcome too to Dr. Colin Murphy, who is a fellow at the Institute of Historical Research and a deputy director at the wonderful Mile End Institute. And he covers a dizzying range of themes and research areas, ranging from neoliberalism to industrialization, the world of finance, constitutional agitation, European integration. Really, I could spend the hour just talking about Colin's kind of the ideas and areas of research that his scholarship has taken him into, and we'll look forward to hearing what he has to say about this particular moment in geopolitics. So I think that's obviously going to form the first part of our discussion, but I think it would be wrong and idle of us not to acknowledge this tremendous news today that Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe has been released from prison, along, it must be pointed out, with Anousheh Ashouri. So at about something around 7:10, 7:15, I'd like to turn to my colleague Kerry Thomas, who has reported this story with distinction very closely, and recently made a brilliant podcast series on Nazanin's case, which I really do recommend to you, and I hope Phoebe might put a link in the chat if you haven't heard it. Do so, because it does tell the story and actually, in a sense, provides you with the essential primer to what has happened today at last. So a good news story in the midst of much bleak and bloodshed and tension. But let's get back to the Ukraine and NATO to start with. Jamie, welcome, and let's just look at NATO, which as is, I think, often forgotten, is an organization as much as a treaty, and one with which you're intimately familiar. What do you understand is NATO's position on this conflict?
First of all, Matthew, thanks to you and Tortoise for inviting me on this evening. It's a great honor. Well, the Allies are first and foremost worried about their own security and their own defense. And as we speak, NATO defense ministers are meeting in Brussels today because the Ukrainian conflict has revealed that NATO is very thinly postured and positioned in Central and Eastern Europe. Only 4 multinational battalions were deployed after Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. That's under 5,000 troops, very little armor, not a great deal of air defense or fighter aircraft. or pre-positioned equipment. So NATO's first activity, first impulsion after the 24th of February was, of course, to rapidly see what it needed to do to shore up its own defenses, because obviously Russia, whatever the outcome of this crisis, is going to be closer to NATO's borders with far more military forces than it had before, thereby decreasing warning time to NATO. And as you can imagine, when you get a couple of dozen Russian cruise missiles hitting a Ukrainian base on Sunday morning, just 20 kilometers from the Polish frontier, it makes many NATO allies very nervous. So NATO's first priority has been to shore up the credibility of its own Article 5 mutual defense clause. Beyond that, obviously, there's a great feeling of solidarity with Ukraine. But on the other hand, it's a difficult balancing act for NATO because, as you can imagine, Matthew, the alliance wants to do what it can to support Ukraine, to keep the Ukrainian resistance going as long as possible, to raise the price for Russia of the invasion. NATO itself as an institution is not supplying lethal weapons, although NATO as an institution has been helping with the training of the Ukrainian military in the past as part of the Partnership for Peace activities, of which Ukraine is a member. And Ukraine has also received a lot of cyber assistance from NATO as such. But as you know, most of the assistance is coming from individual allies. And I think a second focus of the defense ministers meeting today, and also of the NATO summit, which has been convened with President Biden coming back over to Europe next week, will be, is this enough? What more do we need to do? What kind of things make most sense in terms of buttressing the Ukrainian defense, adapted to the conditions on the battlefield? For example, no good giving the Ukraine Army Patriot air defense missiles if it takes several years to train the personnel to operate them. So what makes sense in terms of quick, in terms of what is effective? How can we be sure that the supply routes actually avoid Russian threats to intercept all of this material coming in, and essentially to give the Ukrainians as much support? But on the other hand, as you know, President Biden, NATO leaders have made it crystal clear that they don't want NATO to become party to the conflict, to be a belligerent. But it's a thin dividing line, isn't it, between giving a lot of military assistance and clearly taking sides. We're not on the side of Russia, NATO would say. If you only give sort of very innocuous things like hot water bottles, that's not going to help Ukraine. But on the other hand, trying to calculate where President Putin would see this kind of interference as a reason to attack NATO or to escalate the conflict. There's no sort of scientific answer to that, Matthew. I think it's going to be a question of trial and error in the weeks ahead, depending on how long the conflict lasts.
So it's fascinating, sir, because the posture, it seems, in the prelude to the invasion and certainly during it, has been NATO is a defensive alliance and Ukraine is not a member of NATO. But it's also the case, isn't it, that NATO has taken part in missions in past times where it hasn't actually been fighting on the soil of a NATO member. So it's not a cast iron rule, as I understand it, that NATO can only be involved if as it were, there is a direct attack on one of its members. I mean, there is a degree of flexibility in practice, if not in jurisprudence.
Yes, I would characterize it this way. If your own territory is attacked, all risks have to be accepted because the NATO treaty makes clear that an attack on one is an attack on all, and all must come to the assistance of the attacked party, accepting the consequences of the wider war that would ensue. But on the principle that also supports deterrence and minimizes the chance that an attack would happen. And secondly, that any attack by a major state on a NATO member, notably Russia, would not be restricted to that member state. It would be an attack on all NATO allies. And so, you'd get drawn into the war sooner or later, even if you didn't provide that assistance immediately. So that is an acceptance of all risk. Now, what you refer to, Matthew, is what I would call calculated risk, which is, is this something that NATO militarily can do? Can NATO contain the risks in an acceptable way? Is the objective which NATO posits likely to be met with a fairly modest expenditure of force? Is there international legitimacy and international backing for what NATO is doing? And those are the principles. I lived through this as a NATO official. You mentioned this for many, many years. When we came to the interventions in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s, in Bosnia, which was rather hesitant, by the way, on behalf of NATO for 3 years into the conflict, with a little bit more determination and decisiveness in 1999 in Kosovo. There was no explicitly authorizing UN Security Council resolution then. And of course, this was one reason, Matthew, as you well know, why Russia objected so vigorously to that NATO intervention. But the Allies decided that they believed that there was a basis in international law, in other UN resolutions, in principles of the UN Human Rights Charter. They all got their lawyers in their capitals to sign off on the mission as having a legal basis. And there was a sense that obviously at the time, the risk of outside powers like Russia or China, others getting involved in a way that would escalate the conflict were fairly minimal and could be contained, although Russia, of course, very famously did try to intervene in the conflict after it was all over by sending forces to Kosovo. But that's a famous story. We can go into that if there's interest in the audience tonight. So in a way, you're absolutely right, and we could talk about Afghanistan in a similar sort of category, but there's been a difference between the compulsory nature of Article 5 collective defense and the voluntary nature of the so-called out-of-area crisis management operations. And indeed, one of the more recent ones that NATO carried out in Libya in 2011, there, although NATO as an organization endorsed the mission, only eight allies out of a total of nearly 30 at the time, actually participated in the military mission itself.
It's interesting because unusually, I think, we've seen NATO leaders preemptively ruling out things they would do. So from the very start, it's been completely explicit. We're not going to impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine, which some people have seen as an unnecessary clarity, as it were, in the game of poker with Putin. But leaving that aside, what's been interesting in the last 2 or 3 days is the rather more opaque language used around potential use of chemical weapons by Putin. So, Biden said only there'll be severe consequences and would not elaborate. And then doing the rounds of the American shows on Sunday, the American National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, point blank refused to say what those severe consequences would be, only that, the Americans were in, and other NATO allies were in contact with the Russians, and those consequences would indeed live up to the adjective. What does that tell us about thinking inside the organization about, is there a genuine prospect that if Putin, as we know he is capable, uses chemical weapons, that NATO's position could change?
Well, we'll see, because of course we don't know how long the Ukrainian war is going to go on. We don't know if it's going to lead to a spillover onto NATO territory. We don't know if the spillover will be accidental, Russian planes getting lost over NATO airspace, or Russian cruise missiles missing the target and landing on NATO territory, and so on. And about these kind of border sort of incidents, which are in a kind of gray zone, is it accidental? Is it intentional? Two things. Number one, it's important for NATO to keep a hotline with the Russian military. This has existed for many years between the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, the head of the NATO forces, and General Gerasimov, the head of the Russian forces. They've had many meetings over the years so that they don't misunderstand what's happening in exercises or missile tests and so on. Even in Syria, where the United States has actually fired at Russian forces on one particular occasion, the US and Russia have maintained a so-called deconfliction mechanism so that they can quickly clarify any incidents in the grey zone. I think that's important. The second thing, I think it's important for NATO to maintain a degree of strategic ambiguity, as it's often called. Reason is because if you tell, and this has been the case in the cyber area with NATO for many years, if you tell somebody like Putin, you can attack me up until here, and I'm not going to do anything. I won't like it, but it won't trigger a response. But if you go above this line, then I'm going to respond. You obviously encourage your adversary to engage in those kind of hybrid warfare tactics like cyber, thinking that that will be treated with indifference or at least impunity. On the other hand, where it's clear that an activity is 100% going to engage NATO in an open war, Biden has called it World War III. We can debate that, but an open war with Russia, and the allies, not just the US president, have really put the no-fly zone in that particular category. It means destroying the Russian integrated air defense system if you're going to be able to do it in a way that protects your pilots. That means going deep into Russia, Belarus, Kaliningrad. It means destroying a large number of Russian S-400 and and other anti-air defense systems, quite widespread operations. Then NATO has been very careful, like it's been careful in making it clear that it has no intention of putting NATO forces or missile systems run by NATO on the territory of Ukraine. Again, it's a judgment call, Matthew, but I think the Allies believe that at the time when you've got a very reckless, unpredictable character like Putin launching an operation where maybe he doesn't even know himself how well it's going or what he really wants to achieve in the long run, and he's threatening nuclear strikes, or at least gesticulating with nuclear weapons, then on these really big issues about what NATO's strategic intentions are, it's important to be crystal clear and not play into the Putin playbook that the Russian operation is justified because Ukraine was on the brink of joining NATO. Wrong. NATO was on the brink of installing nuclear weapons or other missile systems in Ukraine. Wrong, and the like. So strategic ambiguity where you're responding to what Russia does outside your territory, but very firmness when it comes to things that are going to immediately embroil you automatically in a conflict with Russia.
Jamie, do you think it's fair to say that to an extent the West and NATO specifically has rather strung Ukraine along since the end of the Cold War? Because you're right that, of course, that there was no immediate prospect of Ukraine joining NATO, but it's also true, is it not, that at various points particularly since the Budapest Memorandum in '94, that when the final deal was struck to ensure that Ukraine gave up its nuclear capacity, Ukraine has been, gently encouraged to, as it were, get into the slipstream for NATO membership. I think particularly under George Bush Jr., but not only under George Bush Jr. Should we look back on that record with a degree of embarrassment and perhaps even shame that we encouraged Ukraine to think that this might be in prospect, if not immediately, when in practice it wasn't?
Yeah, that's a question I've been frequently asked, Matthew, as you would rightly expect, because the whole debate over NATO enlargement has been going on since the middle of the 1990s, as you well know, with defenders and detractors very vocal on either side of the argument. If you look at it from the point of view of principle, then NATO is on good grounds. Russia signed up to the Paris Charter of the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, at the end of the Cold War. It repeated in the Istanbul Charter of 1999 the right of, that it recognized the right of any state in Europe to be part of an alliance if it so wished. And in 1994, it also agreed with a number of Western countries, including the UK, in the Budapest Memorandum to uphold the sovereignty of Ukraine. So in a way, NATO is only doing things that Russia, at least at the level of principle, has at least acquiesced in. So you could look at it from that way, but I know that you're looking at it from the point of view of strategy and practical politics. neutrality hasn't helped countries vis-a-vis Russia in the past. Moldova has always been pledged to neutrality, even now, but it didn't stop Russia from occupying Transnistria, of course, at the end of the Cold War with the 14th Army, and those forces are still largely there today. And ironically, it was only after the Russian occupation of Crimea in 2014 that Ukraine actually changed its constitution to reject non-alignment, which was its official policy up until 2014, and changed the constitution explicitly to open up the door to NATO membership. So, you could also take the view, Matthew, that Russia is its own worst enemy here. The more it's sort of bullied its neighbors, the more it's driven them towards NATO rather than driven them away from NATO. And that argument, of course, can be made vis-a-vis Georgia, given the Russian occupation of Abkhazia or South Ossetia, which has also gone on since the early 1990s. But to my mind, Ukraine was on a track up until 2014, which would have made much greater sense had Russia accepted it at the time, and had the West, and I include NATO, the EU, the Western powers, had this more explicitly as its objective. Because, of course, as you remember, the reason for Putin's move against Crimea was the fact that there was this pro-EU movement in Kiev, and there was the agreement to sign a deeper comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU, and the former president, of course, Ukraine, Yanukovych at the time, accepted it, then under pressure from Putin backed away from it at the very last minute. The signing ceremony was cancelled, and what it suggested was that that crisis was not a crisis between NATO, Ukraine and Russia. It was a crisis between the EU, NATO and Russia. And it's notable that as enthusiasm in Kiev for NATO membership is called, enthusiasm for EU membership in Kiev. You saw Zelensky a couple of weeks ago, very, in a very demonstrative way on TV, signed the application letter with his ministers to send off to Brussels, and clearly that was the orientation that they seem to want. It was always the orientation that they had before 2014, where public opinion polls in Ukraine showed that enthusiasm for the EU was much higher than NATO. Those opinion polls, again, only really swung in favor of NATO after 2014. And if the EU and Russia had been able to at least have an understanding that Ukraine would follow the path of Ireland or Austria or Switzerland, or no, excuse me, not Switzerland, of course, not an EU member, lapsus, Finland, but all of these countries, and remain a partner of NATO, maybe some kind of strategic accommodation could have happened on that basis. But Russia then turned against EU membership as vigorously as it did against NATO membership. And I also believe, just as a kind of coda to this, that it was a mistake by the EU meeting in Versailles just last week to sort of go back to business as usual when it came to enlargement, and be very sort of very cautious, and not immediately at least give Ukraine formal candidate status. Not that Ukraine would join the EU for many years, but it would allow the EU to use far more instruments vis-a-vis Kiev, economic investments and so on, help the country more. Now, I'm giving you a long answer to this, Matthew, precisely because it is a complicated question. I do believe, however, that NATO did make one mistake, and that's the decision that it took at its summit in Bucharest in 2008, when it offered Ukraine NATO membership. If you can bear with me for a minute, I'll explain why. But if you're fed up listening to me, I'll stop talking and hand the virtual microphone back to you.
Well, let me come back to you, Joe, because I want to bring in Colm and find out what his thinking is. Colm, welcome very much to this Open News meeting. Let's sort of go back to basics. When you look at NATO's performance, such as it's been in the last 3 weeks plus, what does that say about the state of the alliance and its purpose, and really, how real a organization it is in terms of security maintenance and also, I suppose, its self-appointed role as one of the key pillars of the West?
Thanks for having me. Well, I guess I would answer that from my position of expertise, which is very different to Jamie's, which is a historian of British politics. And that might seem quite insular, really, given the bombs are literally falling on Ukraine. But it does matter because domestic politics in different NATO member states does affect its effectiveness, really, as an alliance. I would say NATO's position has really quite strengthened in the last few weeks. And a good place to look at that is in the British left, which is my particular area of expertise. If you've gone back a couple of years ago, NATO was quite an ugly word within the British left, and not just among the Corbynite left, but among more centre-left strands as well, because of the intervention in Libya was mentioned, but we could also mention Afghanistan, which obviously quite recently, arguably failed. But because of Putin's self-defeating actions and this invasion, the anti-NATO left has been quite marginalized within British political discourse, and I would argue for quite good reasons. It's badly misread the dynamics at play here. It keeps talking about NATO enlargement, but as Jamie says, while it was, I agree, it was a mistake to offer NATO membership in 2008. Ukraine wanted to join NATO because Putin wants to invade it, and that's the kind of the main driver here. It's not, in this instance, American imperialism, as is claimed by Stop the War. So to answer, as far as I can answer your question, Matthew, I would say that NATO's effectiveness politically has increased in recent weeks.
That's interesting because, I mean, the unity has certainly increased. What in terms of looking ahead, what do you see that unity leading to?
Well, I'm an historian, so I'm always wary about making predictions.
But you make it. But sorry to interrupt, but it's very interesting that you. I think the fact that you are a British historian is really important, because let's never forget that one of the founders of NATO was Ernest Bevin. This is an organisation that has its roots partly in a Labour government, post-war Labour government. So there is a tradition there and a concept of the international order. And what I'm fascinated by is what that order might look like after this particular crisis, which may be a very long time.
Well, the best model we have is the Cold War, but I'm wary of making a simple comparison with the Cold War. But I'll start with why that makes initial sense. You're right that the post-war Afghan government was absolutely central to the foundation of NATO. And the main reason for that was the Cold War. Bevin was an anti-communist trade union leader. He fought communists as a trade unionist in the 1920s and 1930s. That's a key reason. It's not the only reason, but it's one of the key reasons why he took a very clear line in the 1940s on the dangers of the Soviet Union and the need for a military alliance. There are other reasons too, notably his belief in Britain's role in the world as at that time still an imperial power. But yeah, I think that the Cold War is is the model we may have going forward. If we cut off Russia economically, politically, diplomatically in the way that it's going, then that might seem to make sense. The reason I'm wary about the Cold War as a model is it's too early, really. We do have, I think a Rubicon has been crossed, but the idea that we would move back towards a decades-long conflict with proxy wars fought across the world, in Latin America, in Africa, I'm just cautious about making that kind of statement. Now, what will the world order look like? I think the big unknown here is China. What China will do with Russia, and there I can't claim to have any expertise on what China's strategy is, but that surely to me seems quite crucial. If China abandons Putin, despite very recently backing him up, then we're going to have what a lot of people are talking about, a shift towards a West versus authoritarian geopolitical framing. But if China backs away from that, then it will get surely muddier, and countervailing pressures like the economic turmoil we're about to head into, or currently already experiencing with energy prices, like the climate transition, where China's role is arguably different. That might complicate that matter. So I'm sorry my answer is I don't know, but I hope we're giving you good reasons as to why I don't know. It pivots on China.
The context is fascinating, and I'm absolutely positive you're 100% right about China. Just another sort of historical question then. At the time of NATO's dramatic expansion after the end of the Cold War, the norm was to assume that this was as natural as the expansion of the EU, the expansion of neoliberalism and globalization. This was all part of a package of the changing global settlement post the fall of the Berlin Wall. There were, though, many voices at the time who said, hold on a second, is it wise to expand NATO's membership in this way? Won't this come back and bite us under a very different kind of leadership in Russia to the one that was prevalent at the time? Do you think, I mean, obviously this is not a narrative that's dominant at the moment, but it is around. Do you think there's any truth in it that actually we expanded NATO too fast and those chickens are now coming home to roost?
I think there's some truth in it, but I don't want to push it too far. I think it is certainly true that there was an element of naivety about the unipolar world in the 1990s. I think that's sometimes overstated. I read your piece recently about the misreading of Francis Fukuyama, and I entirely agree. It's not as if, I think sometimes it's overstated the naivety of this moment. I do think that it may have been wise to, for strategic reasons, to try and mitigate NATO-specific expansion. And the 2008 offer, which Jamie's already mentioned, he has more expertise than me, and is a good example of that. However, the problem here is, if you, at least on paper, talk about democracy and sovereignty and the right of individual nation states to choose their destiny, the problem is many of those nation states in Eastern Europe wanted to join NATO. So that's the fundamental ideological problem here, really. And it's difficult to know what to say in response to that. I think it means that you have to give more honest answers than perhaps has been done in the past. But that's quite a hard thing to say no to. So I think, yes, I think there is some truth in it, but I would not want to push it too far for that quite strong countervailing reason.
To repeat a question I put to Jamie, did we, in that context, because you make a really important point about countries seeking membership, did we string Ukraine along on NATO?
I mean, I'd be interested to hear more about what Jamie says about 2008. I think potentially, yes. I think it seems like that from the outside. Did we string them along? It seems like it from the outside, yes, because if the intention was that they were never going to join for defense and strategic reasons, then making that kind of promise, it seems, I guess it seems naive, or it seems, you know, I guess a little, yeah, naive of what Russia under Putin could be, which is quite a common failing of political leaders, left and right, across the West in that period, in the late 2000s and the early 2010s. But it does seem like that from the outside. If you're going to offer membership in that way, you have to follow through. So particularly for a military alliance, I think military alliances, even more than economic alliances like the EU. Well, the EU does have a military element, but a military alliance really does have to be made very seriously. The offer has to be made seriously because you have to follow through on Article 5, right?
No, absolutely. Thank you so much, Colin. I'm sure we'll come back to you before the end. I just want to come to Julie Bush, who had some very interesting remarks in the chat about you know, what NATO is for. And Julie, why don't you you know, say what's on your mind rather than me try to paraphrase you poorly.
Hello?
Hi, you there?
Yes, I am. Sorry. Yeah, I was just saying in the chat earlier about a few commentators have said today about how Putin, referencing Putin's Potemkin military, and that actually, you know, Putin's military ability is very weakened. And can you still hear me?
Yes, absolutely. Go ahead.
It's very weakened, and I mean, I don't know how that relates to his nuclear abilities. That's for sure. But Putin, I think Putin sees the West as very weak. Really, we haven't stood up to him. You know, he invaded Ukraine in 2014. He annexed Crimea. He's been involved in the US 2016 election, possibly in Brexit. He's used chemical weapons on UK soil. He's done all of these things. And what have we really done? What has the West really done? How have they really stood up to him?
Would you like to see NATO's remit rewritten after this conflict, or perhaps even during it, to have a much broader definition of its responsibilities? Because the response of NATO to that would be, well, actually, you know, Ukraine is not part of our terrain, you know, and as horrific as what's going on there is, it would be a intolerable breach of the limits of NATO as understood in the global order if we then stepped onto Ukrainian soil. Is that a naive? Is that what I'm saying? Is that no longer tenable as a definition of NATO's core mission?
Yeah, I'm certainly no expert in these things, but I think it's very difficult to have not stood up to Russia and Putin for all these years over many different things. And I know that Ukraine are not a member of NATO, but to be watching genocide, and it is a genocide if you look at the definition of genocide, trying to get rid of a nation that is European, and the European parts of NATO just watching. It's a very difficult place for them to be, I feel. I just, at the beginning of this conflict, and that's only 3 weeks ago, I was like, yeah, we shouldn't get involved. We shouldn't get militarily involved, but I know that the remit of NATO is what it is, but can you really watch genocide in Europe and do nothing?
Which I think is, in a way, the question that hangs over the entire free world at the moment. Thank you so much, Julie. And before you go, Jamie, I do want to come back to you, as promised, to pick your brains on Bucharest 2008, if I may. Tell us why it happened and why it was a mistake.
Yeah, let me make it clear. I'm not arguing this because I'm against the offer to Ukraine to be part of the alliance.
Understood, yeah.
But I think the tactics of that decision were not wise, and I felt it at the time. This was because as you recall, there was a division between the United States, you mentioned George W. Bush, and the French and German leaders. The French and German leaders did not want an invitation to be issued to Ukraine and Georgia for the reasons that you can guess when it came to the impact on Russia and the likely Russian reaction, although it wasn't deemed then to be obviously what we've seen with Putin now. On the other hand, George W. Bush had just been in Georgia, where he was given a rapturous reception, and he sort of felt that these new democracies on the territory of the former Soviet Union should be supported. So on the eve of the summit, NATO had a position, which was that obviously it would increase its partnerships with Ukraine and Georgia, but the membership question would not come up. And then President George W. Bush obliged the State Department at the last minute to change position and to push for the offer of membership. And this would have meant giving the Ukrainians the so-called membership action plan, which is the equivalent of opening the sort of negotiations that you have with the various chapters for joining the EU. This was opposed by France and Germany. So eventually, of course, under the pressure of the summit, the media, the need to sign off on the communique, they agreed to compromise, which was that the Americans got what they wanted. Georgia and Ukraine will be members of NATO one day, but no date, but will be members, not could be members or can be members. But the French and Germans got what they wanted, which was there would be no membership action plan. So nothing would start in terms of the process. Why do I think this was a bad decision? Well, you can guess, because I think it instead of the best of both worlds, it was the worst of two worlds. On the one hand, it obviously raised Russian anger because the NATO had offered the membership. But on the other hand, NATO hadn't moved on it. So it conveyed an impression of weakness. And it therefore seemed to Putin a good opportunity to challenge the decision. And he didn't challenge it in Ukraine. As you remember, Matthew, he challenged it in Georgia in 2008 by once sending more Russian forces into Georgia, into Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and literally detaching those areas from Georgia. And of course, NATO condemned the decision and cancelled talking to the Russians in the NATO-Russia Council for a couple of months, not for very long, before going back to sort of business as usual. So my sense is that, and what Colin was saying earlier, I agree with. Either you offer membership and you move on it with a membership action plan, and you do what you need to do to make sure that you're going to defend Ukraine, or you don't do it, but you don't sort of half do it and then put Ukraine in a worse position. You remember, doctors talk about the Hippocratic Oath. Whatever you do, don't kill the patient, do no harm. And I just felt that for an organization like NATO, that halfway house was not one of the best decisions the alliance has taken.
Thank you so much, Jamie. I know you have to leave, but we're really grateful to you for your insights on this, because it's incredibly enlightening to have someone who's been inside the organization giving us that kind of knowledge. So thank you. I want to execute an inelegant handbrake turn, though, but really without apology, and go to my colleague Kerry Thomas on what's a really big day. Kerry has been kind of in the vanguard of reporting on the Nazanin case, particularly with a just fantastic podcast series, which if you, as I said at the start, if you haven't heard it before, do listen to it, because it's the definitive kind of context to what is happening today. So Kerry, first of all, how are you feeling?
I like overclaiming, but I'm not remotely going to overclaim on this one, because
no, I know from talking to you and obviously listening to and admiring your work on this, that you became, you communicated a lot with Richard Radcliffe. You became very close to the story. It is one of those days where you would not be human if you didn't feel a surge of excitement and
and honestly, I've been on the verge of tears all day, but I think that's true of a lot of people, actually. I think if you just go on Twitter, you can see that people understand the sort of depth of the emotional story. And I think whilst I keep saying to people, let's not forget Anousheh Shuri, let's not forget Murad Tabaz, let's not forget poor Mehran Raouf, who hasn't even had a mention today and isn't part of this package at all. Saying all that, I think my admiration for Richard as a figure of bravery and dedication and just a sort of an exemplar of love. He's just an extraordinary person, and to do what he did, to gamble as he did, to go public, and he was the first to do that in this country. To do that is to see that, to calculate that by doing that he could keep Nazanin safe when she was in Iran, and that he would increase her chances of coming home when that wasn't the practice, that wasn't the advice. And he's dealing with family in Iran, he's dealing with other hostage families here who are taking a different view of things. It is an extraordinary feat of smart PR, but just profound bravery as well, I think.
I mean, I was going to ask you about Richard, really, because it's always true in these situations that there is a home front of families. I mean, one thinks of Jill Morell, John McCarthy. There are campaigns at home, but this was a completely different order, because as you explained much better than me, the Foreign Office really likes to keep a grip on these situations and asks the families to behave with a measure of discretion, and knows that they'll do some press, but not to become the focus of the campaign. And Richard really did become the focus of the campaign. He went on hunger strikes. He became friendly with the members of the media, notably yourself. He had an awesome sort of poise about him. Now, how much is that just him, or do you think he has changed forever, that these kind of situations will be negotiated and expedited, one hopes?
I think he's changed things forever. And I think I was just on a call with Jason Rezaian, the Washington Post guy who was taken hostage and released in 2016, just before Nazanin was taken. And he said, you in the UK will look back on Richard as a transformative figure, in the way that, if we're ever going to solve the hostage crisis, if we're ever going to stop countries behaving like Iran, if there's ever going to be some new sort of international concord where countries agree to increase the price of hostage taking so it no longer becomes viable to a country like Iran, then Richard will be seen as an absolutely key figure in changing the way that hostage taking is thought about. And I hope that he does have, I hope there's enough of a long tail to Nazanin's release that we don't forget about Murad and Mehran, and that we do keep coming back to them over the next few months. Because one of the downsides of a deal like this has been done, we knew in a sense, because Iran had told us what the price was for Nazanin and for Anousheh. Now we don't know what the price is for Murad. We don't know what the price is for Mehran, and so I think there's we're not through this yet. This is chapter one of a very incomplete story.
As your podcast series made clear, that this is a very long and by no means linear story. But now you look back on the last few days, weeks, what was the moment, do you think, when the prison gate was finally unlocked? What did the trick?
It was really when the nuclear talks failed in Vienna last week. And so, in effect, but people will know, most people will know, there was a deal that Dominic Raab had done in July last year, which would have settled the tank debt and brought Nazanin and Anousheh home. And in the end, that deal was pulled because the Americans asked the British to stall it to see whether they could release their hostages as well as the UK hostages at the same time. And throughout that period, from July to now, the liaison, the Foreign Office liaison people were saying to the hostage families in this country, we've agreed to go along with the Americans for the time being, but we've reserved the right to go our own way if circumstances change. And I'm not sure the hostage families ever believed that the UK would do that, but that was the official position. And so when the Vienna talks failed, and Jason Rezaian and the American hostages were released on the same day that the first Vienna round was implemented in 2016, and although the government would want to deny any kind of linkage between the nuclear talks and the hostages, truth is it was there for all to see. So when those talks failed, it was really a fork in the road for the British government. They had the choice really of saying, all right, we will remain in lockstep with the Americans and really leave Nazanin and Anousheh in limbo until potentially the Vienna talks can be resuscitated. 2 years, 3 years, who knows? Or you have to do what Liz Truss has done and say, this is the moment where we can go our own way.
I totally appreciate the entanglement up to last week with the Vienna process, but we surely could have settled this sooner.
Totally. We could have settled it, at any number of moments it got much more difficult to settle post 2016 when Nazanin was taken, because up till that point, it was a pure debt. after that point, it could at least be accused of being a ransom. And so it became a more complicated question after 2016. There were sanctions 2008 to 2016, so that was complicating. But really the story of why the debt has not been paid is about incompetence, intransigence, taking the route of least resistance, just a general sort of, Whitehall being crap for, year after year after year, rather than some sort of, there's no plan, there's no strategy. It's just a failure of grip and determination and vision to see that this might in the end rebound on somebody.
And Boris Johnson's famous gaffe as Foreign Secretary, when he implied, I think at a select committee meeting, or stated that Nazanin had been teaching journalism, which completely opened up the false charges of espionage. How was that a symbol of incompetence, or was it actually consequential?
I think if you talk to Richard, if you talk to people like Alistair Burt, they don't think it was in the obvious way consequential. It didn't immediately make her situation quite as much worse as people thought it would. So I think you've got a choice in the way you think about Boris Johnson in this. You can either think about him as the Foreign Secretary who hadn't briefed himself, who messed up catastrophically. That's true. But I think it's equally true that having messed up catastrophically, he set about cleaning up his own mess with a will around Whitehall that did start things moving. So, you can choose which way you look at that, but I think he was both hopeless and consequential in the way that he responded to his own failings.
Do you, what do your antennae tell you, Kerry, about how this sort of fits into the broader landscape? That he's in the Gulf dealing with Saudi. How does this fit in with our broader relationship in the region with Iran and other nations, and particularly one thinks of the changing sort of dynamics of energy policy?
Yeah, I think it's I think it's hard to locate it for me within that environment. So it's clearly there, but I haven't been able to sort of really spend the time today thinking about where it does fit in that. I think there's a fit with Ukraine. I talked to Richard, when Ukraine sort of appeared on the horizon, and we were sort of wondering to ourselves whether Ukraine would be a moment when the priorities of the international community would be so clearly focused somewhere else that Britain could do a deal which might otherwise have been controversial. Or would it be a moment when, as also happened, actually Russia started to mess around with the talks in Vienna, and it could have gone the other way. So I think the countries are neighbours of Iran will not pay much credence to the idea, which is sort of baked into this deal that's been done, that the £400 million can only be spent on humanitarian goods. I think Richard's an accountant. He knows that money is fungible, and I think in the end, the Revolutionary Guard, if it wants to spend the money in a certain way, will find, if it wants to spend it on rocket launchers, it will spend it on rocket launchers. So I think, there'll be an acceptance around the neighbourhood in the Gulf that it could make things worse in that respect. But and then maybe it is an advantage that the world is looking so determinedly in another direction.
It seems to, it's such a fascinating story, because it seems to me to sort of encapsulate the kind of narrative journalism that Tortoise has been doing in the last year plus, and and not just that, but because it is, of course, a unbelievably intense and emotionally charged case study. But I have a feeling, and listening to you, Kerry, it strengthens that feeling, that there are lots of very broad lessons to be drawn from this. And I'm just wondering what you today, what your initial feelings are about the lessons moving forward of this whole, often very painful saga have been about how we handle what will be a situation that doubtless recurs with, obvious differences.
I think one of the things that's striking, I talked to a whole number of former foreign secretaries as I've been working on this, and if you talk to foreign secretaries before before Boris Johnson, and they wouldn't go on the record, so I can't say who they are. But the determination not to deal with individuals. The job of the Foreign Office was tectonic, that it was geopolitical, that the likes of Nazanin were just a complete damn nuisance, and it was wrong in principle really for the Foreign Office to get involved in something of that sort of granularity. That was so, I think, baked into the thinking of the Foreign Office that they were kind of instinctively opposed to really dirtying their hands with this kind of business. And I think, I'm sure you'd agree, Matt, that seems to me like a fundamental error in thinking that if the British position is to say that an individual doesn't matter, then we've located ourselves in the same neck of the woods as China, or that's not a great place to be.
So, I mean, do you, obviously it's such early days, early hours, but are you at least cautiously optimistic about this leading to something approaching a structural change in the way that we handle these things?
It's willed. I mean, on the question of dealing with individuals, I think.
Yeah, I mean, and also an approach to diplomacy that is a bit more networked and textured and can harness the power of an individual like Richard to the good.
Yeah, which is probably a sort of a lesson of our age, isn't it? As well as Richard has been a brilliant campaigner, and the social media campaign around him has been so important. And whether even my old school Foreign Office could have resisted the power of the individual, amplified through social media, I don't know. So it seems to me it's a fit with where we are, as well as being sort of ethically the right place to be. So it does feel that shift has been structural, and we're not going to go back to where we were. The more difficult thing, I think, is will there emerge some sort of global consensus that says that we are going to deal with hostage-taking nations differently, because Iran isn't on its own. China effectively takes hostages. An Irish airline pilot was returned to Ireland after 3 years recently and it was effectively taken hostage by China. And so we're seeing a growth in this around the world. And countries like America and the UK know that the costs of that, of allowing it to carry on, are enormous just in capacity, that you end up spending more time on an individual than on some countries. And that's a thing that institutionally countries want to get beyond. So I think I'm not sure that there's a real effort beyond London and Washington to try and frame that new global approach that will raise the price to hostage-taking countries. But that seems to me the important piece that would need to happen, in order to put us in a better place in 10 years' time.
It's fascinating, though, isn't it, when listening to you talk, Gary? It's because one thinks on just in last year, you've had Marcus Rashford changing policy on food poverty. You've had Jack Monroe changing how inflation is defined, and now you've got Richard Radcliffe, making an absolutely fundamental challenge to the way that international diplomacy around hostage taking is done. That's new, isn't it? I mean, these individuals which have huge spotlights upon them, I guess largely because of social media, but not only because of that. This is a new way of conducting how policy is made.
Yeah, and I think I know more about Richard than I do about Marcus Rashford or sorry, my brain's not. He certainly learned lessons from abroad. Yep. So he was very quickly in touch with Jason Resign's brother, who'd been sort of instrumental in the social media campaign around him. And so I think you are seeing these sort of individuals who either start out highly networked or find ways to become highly networked, who can then become figureheads for something effective and very meaningful in the long run, not just the short.
Well, thank you, Kerry, and for what it's worth, congratulations for your part in it, which has been echoed in the in the chat by several people I noticed, and rightly so. We are out of time, alas. I'm hugely grateful to our speakers, and I know it's been a slightly disjointed conversation, but I'm glad it has been so, because it would have been quite wrong not to have talked about Nazanin. Just returning to the NATO issue, I think that what has struck me is that, as Jamie said, that there is a kind of strategic ambiguity about the way that NATO works now, and that moving forward, this will have to be revised in a way that takes account of particularly the position of neutral countries. I think you made a very good point about the fact that Moldova's neutrality has not served itself well. And I think Colm's extremely persuasive on the need for NATO to consider where it stands apropos of China in particular, because the world that emerges from this crisis, whether it lasts 10 more days or 10 more years, is going to be fundamentally different. And an alliance that was founded in 1949 probably needs to have at the very least a spring clean, and perhaps even something of a reset when we emerge from this. Let us hope sooner rather than later. I'm sorry we've had to slightly rush the ending. Hugely grateful to you all for coming, and to our speakers again. Do come to our think-ins for the rest of the week. Do check out our Invaded series of voicemails from Ukraine, and our Daily Sense Maker, of course, which is a invaluable guide to what's going on in the world of the conflict and other things. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and thanks very much for coming on. Bye for now.